Hello again. I was tempted to call this video the Great Poverty Scam, but I was worried this might have sounded offensive. When I talked here about the unequal educational outcomes of black children and those of Chinese heritage in Britain, for instance, the blunt fact that 5 times as many Chinese students gained 3 A's at A level as those of African and Caribbean origin, I'm invariably told that the real cause is poverty and that race has nothing to do with the case, except of course the institutional racism which works against the interests of all black people in the country. The modern idea of poverty I find a fascinating one. We're regularly assured in newspaper articles and on the television that the number of poor children in both Britain and the United States is rising as a result of the heartless and cruel policies of the Conservatives and Republicans. How else can we explain such things as the exponential spread of food banks? Of course, the heartless and brutal among us might point out that these enterprises are often set up and run as publicity stunts by left-wingers, and that if you start offering people free food or free anything else, you'll certainly find takers. You can create a demand for free things simply by providing them. Am I then denying that there are poor people in the Western world? Do I not think that the poverty in industrialised countries such as Britain and America is rising? I suppose this depends entirely on what you mean by poverty. As a child, I grew up in a house without a bathroom and with no inside lavatory either. We had a tin bath which we filled with saucepans heated on a range. Sometimes there wasn't enough food to satisfy our hunger. I had a pair of shoes and a single coat. We had no television in the house, we didn't have a telephone, no washing machine, no refrigerator, no record player, central heating, no. In the winter we had ice on the inside of the windows. We were poor. What is meant today by poor? According to the British charity the Children's Society, a third of children in the United Kingdom, that is almost 5 million of them, live in poverty. This sort of claim is routinely reported in the media and nobody dares question it for fear of appearing uncaring and cruel. I will say right now, because I don't care particularly what people think, this is all a lot of nonsense. And most ordinary people know this very well, but do not like to say so. What do we mean by children living in poverty? The measure used is simply that if a child lives in a family whose income is below 60% of the average, then he or she is poor. In other words, a few years ago, poverty was measured in absolute terms. If a child had insufficient food or lacked a coat or a pair of shoes, then this was a poor child. The measure now used is not absolute but relative poverty. For example, if the average family has 2 colour televisions in the house and you only have one in your house, then you can be regarded as a pauper. If the neighbours can afford holidays in the south of France and your family can only spend a week at the seaside, this means that you are poor. If many people are using solid gold knives and forks and yours are only made of silver, then by this particular definition, you are poor. You're living in poverty. Everyone else can afford gold knives and forks and yours are only made of silver. Many people do not realise that the official way of defining which family is poor has changed in this way. And when they hear that 5 million children in Britain live in poverty, they imagine that millions of children might be going hungry or do not have shoes on their feet. My wife is a social worker and I've spent quite some time teaching in schools in a very deprived part of East London. We both found a very similar and curious thing. We both buy clothes from charity shops. When we buy new stuff, it's often from cheap places like Primark. This is common with people in fields like social work, of course. We both notice that the parents with whom we come into contact in our work were invariably much better dressed than we were, often with designer clothes and expensive accessories, to say nothing of ostentatious gold jewellery. My wife's jewellery is modest silver necklaces and earrings. Some of her clients had solid gold dollar sides round their necks, which were 2 or 3 inches long. Both the parents, the kids I taught, and my wife's clients were technically very poor. That is to say, on paper, they were thoroughly deprived. They were poverty-stricken. There are elements here of both class and ethnicity in the disposal of what money is available. Middle-class parents didn't worry much about having the latest gear and were happy to arrive at the school gates looking like refugees or flood victims. The Caribbean mothers, on the other hand, would not have been seen dead in clothes bought from charity shops. Their kids had to have box-fresh trainers and stylish clothes as well. I used to think that if some of the parents had spent a little less money on flashy jewellery and fancy clothes, then they might have been able to afford tutors for their kids, like the Indians. The curious thing here, of course, is that many of the best dressed parents, and nearly all my wife's clients, were technically on the edge of starvation. On paper they could barely make ends meet, and yet here they were, looking like fashion models. Their homes too were equipped with the latest games consoles and 72-inch television screens. On the face of it, this is a bit of a mystery, I suppose, for anybody that doesn't actually have dealings with real people. These are the families that we read of in The Guardian as being in abject poverty, and yet they have a higher standard of living than the teachers, social workers and other professionals with whom they come into contact. This is only a mystery if you're the kind of gullible idiot who believes what he reads in the newspapers. Most of the people were theoretically wholly dependent upon state benefits, which meant that they were supposedly living on £75 a week, which was expected to pay for all their food, clothing, gas, electricity and so on. Obviously, this is ridiculous. If somebody would only had that amount of money coming in each week, if they bought a pair of shoes, it would mean going hungry the following week, or they wouldn't be able to heat their home. Nobody lives entirely on benefits. The official figures of what people are living on bears no relation whatever to their actual income. Everybody other than left-wing journalists knows this perfectly well. I mean, it's certainly common knowledge among social workers in London and amongst teachers too. Single mothers do not receive any money for their child's upkeep if they are on benefits and the father pays maintenance. The state takes all the maintenance, so the mothers are still just reliant on the small amount that they're given. The father pays the maintenance and the state seizes it and uses it for its own purposes. So most of these single mothers come to a private arrangement with the fathers. They accept a lesser amount than the fathers would have to pay in maintenance if they were to be caught by the state, and everybody's happy. Almost everybody on benefits has an additional source of income. This ranges from running clothing catalogues and being paid commission, dealing in drugs, having a part-time cleaning job which is off the books. I've never encountered a single person in Britain who was genuinely reliant only on state benefits. Those working always manage to reduce their apparent income in order to qualify for various free things as well. The less money you seemingly have coming in, the more you can get things from other sources, whether charities, the local authority or state agencies. Even where this is not done, it is possible to live quite comfortably on 60% of the average income, Britain is such a prosperous nation that 60% of the average income is still enough to give a decent standard of living, despite it being the technical point at which people fall into poverty. This all ties in with what I have previously said, both about the lack of diversity in some areas and also about the academic attainment of black students as opposed to Indian, white and Chinese ones. Two reasons are popularly advanced for the lack of diversity, by which is meant the absence of black people in places such as Oxford University and professions such as civil engineering, medicine, law and so on. One of the excuses is that institutional racism is at work to exclude black people. The other is that economic deprivation prevents them from fulfilling their true potential. That's why the Birmingham Medical School was lowering the grades. The idea was that the black kids lived in such poverty and were struggling to survive, and that they couldn't possibly be expected to get 3 A's. The reason that we see very few black architects, brain surgeons, vets, rocket scientists and so on in Britain is very simple. They don't get the high grades at A levels which are necessary to get into these professions. Around 11% of white children taking A levels get at least 3 grade A's. Only 5.5% of black students get that many good A levels, half as many. The figure for Chinese students, by the way, is 27%. In other words, 5 times as many Chinese students get those vital grades as black students. The poverty and deprivation excuse doesn't really wash. I've taught in awful schools, very deprived schools in the London borough of Hackney. I've watched Caribbean, Indian and Chinese parents of similar levels of supposed poverty and seen how the different groups deal with it as regards their children's education. I've seen Indian parents send their children to school dressed in cast-offs from older siblings and trainers from Primark. At the same time, they're scrimping and saving to pay for extra tuition for their children. I have also seen black children wearing brand new Nike trainers and laden down with gold. These outward trappings are of more importance to the parents than spending money on books or tutors. Everybody can see which children are going to end up with 3 A levels at grade A, and it is more often Indians than it is Caribbeans. It's not that the Indians and Chinese have more money or are better off or more prosperous. It's that they choose to spend what money they do have on investing in their children's future success.